So welcome everyone to this speaker series event. We wait a few more minutes for people to join the meeting before we start. So I guess in about 2 minutes, we start. Okay, so numbers are still going up a bit, but I guess it's better to start off. So a warm welcome to everyone to the first speaker series event of this new year. I'm really delighted to host this event today with a really important topic. We will talk about power today. So for sure, it's going to be very, very, very interesting. So my name is Max Schormair. I'm an assistant professor in Trinity Business School, and I do research in the areas of multi-stakeholder governance, deliberative democracy, and corporate sustainability. I'm very happy to welcome our guest speaker today, Julie Battilana. Julie has kindly agreed to this session today to talk about her new book. Julie is the Joseph C. Wilson Professor of Business Administration in the Organizational Behavior Unit at Harvard Business School and the Ellen L. Gleitzman Professor of Social Innovation at Harvard Kennedy School, where she is also the founder and faculty chair of the Social Innovation and Change Initiative. She is one of the leading international scholars studying politics of change in organizations and in society. Her groundbreaking work on hybrid organizing has been published in the most recognized academic outlets of management science, receiving multiple awards and recognitions over the past years. And in 2020, Julie co-founded a really interesting and exciting global initiative called Democratizing Work, arguing that now finally is the time to democratize firms, decommodify work, and remediate the environment. So she's a very, very engaged scholar and has written a really, really interesting new book. So I had the pleasure of, oh, you cannot see it. That's interesting. Nevertheless, I had a great pleasure reading it, and I really look forward now to hearing more about it from Julie herself. So we at the Trinity Center for Social Innovation at Trinity Business School are very grateful indeed to have you all with us today, that you all took the time for this event. So how will the event go? Julie will kick us off with a brief overview of her book and the key thoughts and concepts, followed by a few questions and comments by myself, and then I open it up to all of your questions. So please use the Q&A function already during her talk for your questions. I will do all I can to make sure that we address as many questions as we can. And as you also know, in the speaker series, we organize a post-event social. We will do this in a different Zoom meeting, and I will share the link to that meeting in the end. And so if you want to engage more directly with members of the audience, with Julie and myself, with cameras on, then that's a good occasion. And Julie kindly agreed. She has a few more minutes after the event to join us. So for sure, we can then continue the conversation. But without further ado, I'm now happy to hand over to Julie to talk about power for all. So Julie, take the stage.
Thank you so much, Max. And thank you very much for this very nice introduction and the warm welcome. Let me share with you all the presentation. Hopefully you can now still see me and see the presentation itself. Wonderful. So I'm very grateful you're taking this time to be with us today. I know it's an incredibly busy time of the year and under difficult circumstances for so many of you. So thank you for being here. I'm going to indeed share with you more about that book that I just published together with my dear friend and co-author Tiziana Cacharo. And the title of the book is Power for All, How It Really Works and Why It's Everyone's Business. And so what I'd like to do first is just tell you a bit more about why we decided to write that book and why is it that we decided to write it now. Well, it's obviously clear to all of us that we've been experiencing over the past 2 years a tragic health crisis, but I think it's also clear to all of us that this crisis that we've been experiencing has not only been a health crisis. The truth is that we've been experiencing and we continue to experience a multidimensional crisis. That's not only a health crisis, but that's also a social and economic crisis characterized by rising inequalities, affecting certain groups more than others in society. And on top of these ongoing crises, we've also been experiencing now for a long time an environmental crisis, and it is still ongoing. Now, if we try to trace the roots of this multidimensional crisis, then I would say that we have to account for the role of neoliberalism, a doctrine that has focused a lot of our attention, energy on maximizing financial value, on maximizing profits. And it is now well established in sociology and in economics that this exclusive focus on financial value maximization has been associated with an increase in the levels of inequality, as well as further destruction of the planet. So if we stay the course, we know what will happen. We will further increase inequalities and we will further destroy the planet. And that scenario is a scenario in which everyone will lose. The people who are in power disadvantaged position, who've been losing for some time, will continue to lose, of course. But the people at the top who are in power advantage positions will also lose. Why am I saying that? Because A, we all live on the same planet, and B, what we've learned from our experiences, from history and from research in social sciences is that when levels of inequality become extreme, then our communities, our societies become less healthy, they become less safe, and they become less productive. So some of us may have a large slice of a pie, but that pie is shrinking and then everyone is losing. So what's pretty clear is that it's a time for change. We need to implement change and we need to change our social and economic systems if we want to address this multidimensional crisis. And if we want to succeed in implementing change, what do we need? Well, we actually need power. Because what is power? Power is the ability of an individual or a group of individuals to influence other people's behavior. And this is why I'm saying that it is so critical that we confront this issue, that we think more about power today, because we are going to need power if we want to change the system. Right? Now, that's a definition of power, though. That's not an explanation. The next question becomes, where does power come from? And this is a question that Tiziana and I I've had the opportunity to ask many people, right, over the past 20 years, not only our students, but really people from all walks of life. We've had the opportunity to meet as we were conducting our research, as we were teaching, as we were advising change makers across the world. And as we've been asking that question, we've come to worry about some of the patterns that we've seen emerge. Why am I saying so? Because it became clear to us over time that people tend to have deep misconceptions in mind about power that prevent them from understanding power for what it is. And in the book, we highlight in the introduction the 3 main misconceptions that we've identified. The first misconception is this idea that somehow power would be a possession. So people come to me and they ask me things like, Julie, do you have a list? I was initially puzzled when people asked me about the list. What's the list you want? Well, what people want to know is, what's the list of personality traits that make people powerful in any situation? Because that's the belief that somehow you have these traits, you possess them or you don't, and if you have them, good for you, because then you're powerful, and if you don't, too bad, because then you'll never be powerful. So some people think it's about charisma, others think it's about good looks, but they want to know what the list is. The second misconception about power is this idea that power is only for the people at the top. that it's only for the top executives, the CEOs, the prime ministers, the presidents, the generals, and so on. And the third misconception that is probably the most widespread is this idea that power is dirty. So if you put all three together, what would happen most often to me is that people would come to me and say to me things like, well, Julie, I don't have the personality trait, so I'm not, one of these powerful people. And anyway, I'm not one of the people at the top, but good for me, because at least I'm not getting my hands dirty. And so I've come to worry a lot about these misconceptions about power. Why? Because they have very serious implications individually and collectively. Individually, if we do not understand power, then we cannot have the impact that we aspire to, right? And that leads to frustration. And when people get frustrated, they turn their back on power. And what do? Then they leave it to others to make decisions and to concentrate ever more power in their hands. And that leads me to the second really detrimental consequences of those misunderstandings. The issue is that if we individually do not understand power, then how can we possibly get organized collectively to prevent, to identify, to stop power abuses when they emerge, right? And this is something that I worry about because, as you know, this is the 15th year in a row that democracy has been declining across the globe. So we have to pay very serious attention to that. Now, even though this is worrisome, I have good news to share. Based on the work we've been doing together with Tiziana, our research, our teaching, our advising, what we've come to see is that when people understand power dynamics, they become much more effective leaders and much more effective change makers. And the other thing we've seen is that power dynamics can be learned. And this is the reason why we decided to write that book, Power for All, right? Machiavelli wrote his very well-known essay about power more than 500 years ago now. It was writing for a prince. We were really writing this book for all with the idea of democratizing access to knowledge about power. So just a few words about the positioning of the book, because I know that it's a mixed audience. Some of you are researchers, academics, others are alumni from the community, practitioners. So let me tell you about the position, right? The purpose is, as I said, to democratize access to knowledge about power, to help everyone uncover the fundamentals of power across three levels: interpersonal, organizational, and societal. Our approach in the book, we're building on our own academic research in organizational behavior, in sociology, and in social psychology. But we're also bridging academic theory and empirical research across multiple disciplines in social sciences, including sociology, management, economics, philosophy, social psychology, political science, history, and law. Now, for those of you who have your academic hats on, if you're interested in going deeper into the academic arguments, we have a long list of footnotes that we assembled because we wanted to make sure that you would be able to go and dive into it. But what we also did is that in the process of writing the book, in addition to building on our research and other people's research, we conducted more than 100 interviews with people from across the globe with very different paths to and through power. And we are using some of their stories to give life to the mechanisms that we've been able to highlight and understand through the research we've been doing and through the research that other people have been doing. Now, let me turn to the critical thing that the book is about, right? In the third chapter, we present what we call the fundamentals of power. I'm going back to that key question: where does power come from? Well, what we explain is that power resides in control over access to valued resources. Bear with me, what does that mean? What it means is that I have power over you if I control access to resources that you need and want. Right? And you have power over me if you control access to resources that I need and want. It could be that you control access to a budget that I need to complete the project I'm working on. And so you have some power over me. Now, in the meantime, it could be that I'm connected to someone you really need to talk to, right? Because you need their expertise to complete the project you're working on. And if so, then if I'm the only person you know who's connected to that person, I also have some power over you. Now, let me give life to this principle with one of the examples we discuss in the book in chapter 7, in fact. That's one of the people we interviewed, Nezuma Njube. So Nezuma lives in Tanzania in a rural community. And I vividly remember the first time I talked to Nezuma, I interviewed her, we were talking about her. She explained to me that as a child, her dream was to become a teacher. She never had the opportunity to go to school, though. And when we were talking about her power, she said to me that she felt that, for the longest time in her life, she had almost no power. And in fact, she explained to me that most of the decisions in the village were made by the powerful members of the village council, and she was not a member of that council. And in fact, she thought that there hadn't been any women who had been actually elected to be sitting on that council. Now, in 2016, though, Nezuma's life radically changed. She went from feeling and objectively being quite powerless in her community to becoming one of the most powerful people. How did that happen? That's because in 2016, she actually encountered an international NGO called Barefoot College. Some of you may be familiar with Barefoot College. Barefoot College has developed a truly innovative program that enables illiterate women across the global south to become solar engineers through learning by doing and peer-to-peer learning. And so Barefoot College came to Nezuma's community. They explained that they would need a volunteer who would come and study with them for 5 months, and that after those 5 months, if the person completed the program, the person would be back in the community with all the materials needed to electrify the community. At that point, the members of the village council knew it was a great opportunity and wanted people to volunteer, so men volunteered. But that's when Barefoot College explained that it would have to be a woman. And that's when Nezuma raised her hand. Initially, her husband didn't want her to go, but together with the representatives of Barefoot College, the members of the village council convinced him to let her go. She studied for 5 months, and then she came back with all the equipment to electrify the community. In doing that, she didn't only literally bring power to the community, but she became one of the most powerful members of the community because she controlled access to a super valuable resource that was missing in the community, electricity. And so that's how she became one of the most powerful people, so powerful that she was asked to sit on the village council, and she's very proud to be representing women on that village council. Now, what is it that we're taking away from this? What we see through Nezuma's story is that once you understand the fundamentals of power, you can debunk the fallacies about power. And some of you may not have any of these fallacies in mind, but I can tell you, based on all the work I've done, that you are working with people, you're surrounded by people who have some of these fallacies in mind. And so my objective here is to equip you with the tools to help them debunk those fallacies. So I want to help you debunk them and help you help other people debunk the fallacies so that they can have more impact and you can truly empower them. So what did we see with Nezuma's story? Power is not a possession, right? Power is always relative. Nezuma had no power. She learned a new skill in her context that made her powerful. If she had learned that same skill to become a solar engineer, but live in an urban community that's already electrified, that new skill wouldn't have given her power. Now, the other thing I want to insist on here is the fact that we human beings value material resources. So yes, you're right to probably be thinking whoever controls a budget, whoever controls money, whoever controls access to land, whoever controls access to electricity, like these people can be powerful, right, in a number of situations. But we do not only value material resources, as we explain in chapter 3 of the book. We also value psychological resources such as achievement, affiliation, autonomy, status, morality. But think about it. Iconic change makers like Mandela, MLK, Gandhi, more recently, Malala Yousafzai, Greta Thunberg, right? What do they have in common, these iconic change makers? Well, they've been standing for moral values that some of us want to be associated with. And that's a great source of power that they've had and they've used to mobilize people behind them and behind the causes that they actually pursue. So again, key things here: power resides in control over access to valued resources. These resources can also be psychological ones. And so power is never a possession, it's always relative. What we can also do now that we better understand the fundamentals of power is we can debunk the other fallacies, the idea that power is only for the people at the top. Well, no, it's not. And in fact, you can hear my French accent. So I had to take you to France at least once in the time we have together. So I'm going to tell you now about a study conducted in France in the 1960s. It's a study that was conducted in a company called La Ceta at the time. A group of French researchers wanted to understand the factors influencing the productivity of workers on floors of factories. Now, what they did is that they contacted this company, La Ceta, that produced cigarettes at the time. And then they agreed that they would come and study the floor of the factory. On the first day of observation, they met with the top management and they asked for the organizational chart. They got this organizational chart, and then they went to observe what was happening on the floor. After a few days, though, they wanted to meet with the top management again. And here is what they said. They said, you probably gave us the wrong organizational chart. As you can imagine, the top management was, all of these people were annoyed. They knew they gave the right organizational chart. But here is what the researchers explained. They said on the chart, it looks like the workers are reporting to foremen, who are reporting to middle managers, who are reporting to top managers. And yet somehow a top manager, a middle manager, or even a foreman comes on the floor of the factory and asks the workers to do something, the workers don't seem to care. But when a maintenance worker in charge of repairing machines comes on the floor of the factory and asks the workers to do something, the workers immediately comply. And the puzzling thing is that those maintenance workers were at the same level as the workers, the lowest in the hierarchy. So the most powerful people were the people who were the lowest in the hierarchy. How was that possible? Well, the researchers got to understand after some time that the machines had a bad tendency to break. And the maintenance workers were the only ones who knew how to repair machines. They controlled the most valuable resource, a machine that worked, right? And that made them powerful. Now, their approach was not ethical. In that case, they actually kept all of the information for themselves and didn't share that with anyone, didn't explain how to fix the machines. But what I want to draw your attention to here is that, yes, the organizational chart gives you information about who has authority, which is, the formal right to give orders and commands in an organization. But the organizational chart is not enough to understand the political landscape, right? Authority can be a source of power, but it is no guarantee of power, right? And conversely, you may have zero authority, like the maintenance workers, but have a great deal of power. And Tiziana and I, in the research we've done together that we actually report in the book in chapter 4, we've asked that question. Who are the most effective change makers in organizations? And what we found through our quantitative and qualitative research is that the change makers who are central in the network of their organization, those are the change makers to whom others go for advice. These people are more effective change makers than others, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. Why? Because they are the people others trust, and trust is a huge conduit of influence. So power is not only for those at the top, it's potentially for all. Now, what I want to do now is also debunk the third fallacy, this idea that power is dirty. Right? But I would say the dirtiness, if anywhere, is not in power. Power is the energy we need to make any kind of change happen. The dirtiness, if anywhere, is in us. So here is what we explain in the book, and this is in chapter 2 of the book. What we talk about is the fact that, yes, power can be dirty, but it doesn't have to be. Why am I saying that it can be dirty? You know that from your experiences, from history, and we also know that from research in social psychology. Power can poison us, and it can poison any one of us. It actually has two very insidious effects on our human psychology. And it's true for all of us. When we are in positions of power for some time, we start becoming more overconfident. We start thinking we're better than others. We deserve to be there. That's when some of us develop a sense of invincibility. It's the well-known trap of hubris. The other thing that power can do to us and our psychology is that when we are in positions of power for some time, it becomes harder for us to put ourselves in the shoes of others. We start seeing everything through our lens, and we think this is the right lens, right? Now, these are the power poisons. But what Tiziana and I have come to see for our research, and we present that model in chapter 2, is that there are power antidotes. What's the antidote to hubris? The antidote to hubris is humility. You need to cultivate humility, and that requires an awareness of our impermanence. And what's the antidote to self-centeredness? Well, it is actually empathy. We need to cultivate empathy, and that requires an awareness of our interdependence. And what we see for our research is that when people do so, that's when they can see power as a responsibility, they adopt a collective orientation, and they can pursue a much higher purpose. Now, I wish we could stop there, but it would be incredibly naive to stop there as we explain in the book. I'd like to tell you a story, another one based on the interviews we conducted, to explain to you why it would be incredibly naive to stop there. This is Vera Cordero. Vera is a social entrepreneur, a pediatrician by background. She lives in Brazil. Early on in her career as a pediatrician, she worked in one of the largest hospitals in Rio de Janeiro, and she was heartbroken to see so many kids coming from the poorest communities in Rio de Janeiro who arrived too late at the hospital or kept coming back because the parents couldn't afford the medication. So Vera founded Instituto Dara. She's dedicated her whole life to saving these kids, but she understood that to save them, she needed a multidimensional approach. So she's not only trying to help the kids, she's trying to help the families deal with healthcare, deal with unemployment, deal with housing issues, deal with citizenship, right? And this multidimensional intervention has been extremely successful. They've helped more than 75,000 people get out of extreme poverty in the Rio de Janeiro area in sustainable ways. And they've now affected the lives of more than 1 million people globally as the model is replicated. Vera is all about humility. She's all about empathy. In fact, initially she didn't want power, and then she made peace with it because she understood, she told me that she needed it to be able to have the impact she wanted. But then as she started winning awards, as she became the social entrepreneur of the year, as she became a frequent speaker at Davos, slowly but surely, she didn't realize it, she said, but things changed. And at some point, her employees and her family confronted her. And here is what they said: Vera, you're not listening anymore, Vera. You keep interrupting us. What's wrong with you? Are you losing sight of the mission? And she said to me, that's when she realized that she had been on an ego trip. She thought she was cultivating humility and empathy, but she was not doing it enough. So she doubled down, in her case, through the practice of meditation. But for some of us, it would be through different pathways that we would double down on humility and empathy. But importantly, she didn't stop there. She actually also changed the processes, the systems, the structures in her organization to ensure power sharing and to ensure that people were really holding her accountable as a powerful person in the organization, and that they would also hold accountable the other powerful people in the organization. One example, she decided that the weekly meetings would be now organized in a different way. She would not be allowed to interrupt anyone. Everyone would talk. They would rotate the order. And it's only after everyone would have talked that she would be able and allowed to react and share her perspective. Now, we've now officially debunked all three fallacies building on the fundamentals of power. So we can now map the political landscape anywhere. Two questions you need to answer, right? What do people value? Who controls access to what they value? That will enable you to understand who's powerful. And then you can now assess your own sources of power. Right? Now, you're probably going to tell me, though, that if you think about the multidimensional crisis we're facing, we individually do not have all the sources of power we need to make the changes that we need to make happen. But if we join forces, there's so much we can do. And we've learned that from history and from all of the research on social movements. Right? So what we've learned and what we do know now is that, yes, we continue to face huge power imbalances, but what we human beings created, we together can change. Now, that being said, and this is my conclusion and what I want to end with, I would say that agitating against the status quo in organizations and in society is critical, but it's not enough. We also need to innovate and to orchestrate. Think about the Occupy Wall Street movement. What a great deal of highly needed agitation, right? And yet somehow the movement died and not much changed. But that's because at the time, we didn't have enough knowledge of all of the alternatives and the innovations out there. And we had not yet brought the public's attention to these alternatives and to these innovations. And so that's why I say, to address the problems we're facing, we actually need agitators who speak out against the status quo and raise public awareness of the problem. Think about Greta Thunberg and the amazing young people behind her as part of Fridays for Future, the movement. But we also need the innovators, the ones who develop actionable solutions to address the grievances. And I know this is a Center for Social Innovation. And so I'm sure that many of you in the audience are among the social innovators. And thank you so much for the incredibly important work. And we also need orchestrators, those who enable coordination and ensure the adoption at scale of the innovation so that we can have a different status quo. So I hope that you now better understand why we decided to entitle that book Power for All. We say that power can and must be for all. Why? Because everybody can grasp the inner workings of power. And once you understand these fundamentals of power, then you can get to understand what you can do to gain a measure of power. Let's not be naive. There are power hierarchies that enable some of us and constrain others. But if you understand the fundamentals of power, at least you can now better understand what you can do, joining forces with others to try and fight unjust power hierarchies that have to be disrupted And this brings me to the last point, that we must understand, build, and use our power individually and collectively as citizens if we want to address the multidimensional crisis we're facing. So if you are interested in more information about the book, we have a website. We actually just put online this week a new power test to help you better understand your needs and wants and other people's needs and wants, and the implications for understanding power dynamics in your life, in organizations, and in society. But thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and exchange now, and for some of you, if you join us later.
Yeah, thanks a lot. A round of applause to you, Julie. Thank you very much for that concise presentation. So I really enjoyed reading the book, and I definitely think it is a really vivid, honest, and energetic account on the topic of power. And I really liked also the fact that you included many different stories from people who were able to change, like you shared 2 examples in your presentation, and there are many more in the book. So I think that makes it tangible and really understandable where you come from. And it's also clear that it's driven by a lot of insights you gained over the years in teaching about power and doing research about this phenomenon. So before I open it up, so I invite people to post their questions in the Q&A section. I have a few points that I would like to make in order sort of to start our discussion. And one thing that I was wondering is, if you say power is relational, then the question of how should this relation in the ideal be? What is the ideal power relation? Is it a relation of balance? And how would that be expressed? So that's one point that I was wondering throughout the book, because I guess you would think unbalance is not good, and sustained unbalance over a long time is not good in power relations, be it between individual people or an organization and an employee. But Julie, how would you describe what is sort of the ideal power relation, if there is such a thing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question you're asking. Like, you know, societies, organizations are inherently political, so we cannot get rid of power. And what I would say is that I always worry when I have students or people come to me and say, you know, the ideal situation is an apolitical organization, and I'm tempted to join this boss because he told me his organization is apolitical. I always say those are to me, this curious situation. Those are people who may be dictators in their, you know, like own way, and they're trying to make others believe it's not political when it is highly political. So your question is an important one. Indeed, you're right to say that it's certainly better when the balance of power is such that our relationship is not going to be characterized by high levels of inequality, and it's not going to be completely unbalanced, but there will be some balance there. Interestingly, this is something that people often have a hard time understanding, because people tend to think of power as a zero-sum game, right? On their mind, what's at stake is either Max is going to have power or Julie, but they're not going to both have power. And this is wrong, because in fact, we may both have power over each other, and it can be a very healthy equilibrium. And it could be that you have a lot of power over me, but that I also have a lot of power over you. And it could be that none of us is going to decide to use that power to get the other to do something. Or it could be that I'm going to use the power I have over you to actually give you more resources and empower you. In the book, we actually use the quote, which is a quote by Toni Morrison, who actually liked to tell our students, if you have any power, then your duty is to go and empower somebody else. You know, so if you ask me about the ideal situation, it would be a situation in which we're using the power we have to empower people to go and do what they have to do if we believe that this thing they're about to do is going to create value for many more people. And by value, I mean not only financial, but also obviously social and environmental value. So yes, the balance is possible. B, in many situations, it is desirable. And when it is unbalanced, we can still be in situations in which maybe you have much more power over me than I do over you, but maybe, Max, you're going to use that to empower me to go do more, and that's going to help rebalance.
So it seems to me that there is sort of a normativity in that concept of power that you are advocating for then? Because another point that sort of, it seems like it is quite an analytical perspective on power in a sense. And it seems in that sense also that you describe sort of the mechanisms and then you can use it. And so it gives you instruments how to think about it and then how to shape it. But then obviously you could misuse it. Also, you could use these tools, and that relates to a question that my colleague Daniel put in the chat. Maybe some people, we just don't want them to have power. So Donald Trump, probably we wouldn't want him to have any power, but unfortunately he has, and he had. So I don't know if you. So you already elaborated a bit on sort of a normativity that the power should be used for something good. But is there sort of a limit where you would say the tools should not be sort of misused or should not fall into sort of the wrong hands if you have understood how power works?
So what I would say is that the model we propose is an analytical model, and it can be used to analyze situations in which people abuse their power. And it can be used to analyze situations in which people use their power to empower others in a very noble way. So you're right to say the model itself is not normative, but then what's absolutely normative and what's a deep moral question for every one of us is, how do we decide? It's why do we want power if we need it at some point? What will we do to acquire it? And then how will we be using it? What are the ends that we're going to be pursuing, right? And so it's an interesting question. Thank you, Daniel. For all, we thought about that a lot. Like the for all, as I mentioned, for us is a way to also position this book as being different from the many books that have been written following in the footsteps of Machiavelli, who has written such an important essay on power. But a lot of these books have been written for people who are already powerful or correspond to a certain category of population. They are enabled by existing power hierarchies, and then they can gain ever more power. And so our book was not only for these people, although we believe that these people have a lot to understand in terms of power sharing, and that I hope that the book can help them better understand how to do that. But this book is for everyone, including those who've been excluded from power for a long time. Now, you're absolutely right to say that everything we write in this book can fall in the wrong hands. The reality is that if you ask me about dictators of the world, trust me, they have very well understood the fundamentals of power, right? Human beings, we have two fundamental needs. We talk about that in the book, the need for safety and the need for self-esteem. And what is it that dictators do? Like, they control our access to resources we need to fulfill our need for safety and self-esteem. And in doing that, they force us to comply with whatever rules they want to have us follow, right? This is the same recipe. It's been the same for millennials now, and it's still the same in millenniums now. It's still the same today, right? So dictators very well understand the fundamentals of power. A lot of the people who abuse power in organizations and in society, even in democratic societies, have quite often very well understood the fundamentals of power. So our hope is that this book will also contribute to educating everyone, and I would say everyone else, so that we can rebalance power. And when it comes to democracies, I think this education is absolutely critical. We need to educate our kids more. Like we teach them well-being at school. This is tremendously important, but we need to spend more time on civic engagement and understanding power. And we shouldn't be thinking power is a dirty side. Again, let's talk about power. Let's talk about how it can be used for evil purposes and noble ones. And let's have our kids early on think about what it means to use your power in a moral way to help enhance a democratic society. And so I think this requires work. And so that's the reason why we decided to go for Power for All for the title of the book.
Yeah, thanks for that. So we have great questions coming in. I have one last point, and then I go over to the audience questions. And that is the role of sort of communication that you would ascribe to once you have done sort of a power analysis of your situation and you know your setup, so to speak. What are the kind of mechanisms how you then sort of use these insights and sort of make use of your power? Which role does communication, democracy, and deliberation play for that in your view?
So, I would say they play a critical role. So if you think about it, you can use the fundamentals of power, as you said, to power map, to get to understand who has power and who doesn't. And then you can use also this information to better understand your own sources of power. And they can be personal, based on your personal attributes and skills. You can also have positional sources of power based on a formal role that you hold in an organization or in a society, or you can have relational sources of power based on your network of relationships, right? Now, once you have a better understanding of your different sources of power, you have to decide how you're going to use them to influence others if you're trying to implement change, right? And this is where, indeed, what you're going to need to do is to agitate, innovate, and orchestrate. And no matter if you're an agitator, innovator, or an orchestrator, what I've seen in my research is that what you need to do if you want to be effective is you need to communicate, you need to organize, and you need to evaluate progress towards change adoption. Now, the way in which you're going to do that, if you're an agitator, innovator, or orchestrator, is slightly different. And the traps you're likely to face are slightly different. But it is critical for you to think about the fact that no matter what, indeed, you'll have to be thinking about how you communicate, the framing, so that you engage people, how you organize, not only online, but also in the real world on the ground to push for change, and then how you will evaluate progress to make sure you don't lose sight of what you're trying to see, you're pushing to see happen in your organization or in the world out there. And that's something we discuss in much more detail in chapter 6 of the book, where we present the agitate, innovate, orchestrate model in detail, and also give examples as to what it means to communicate, to organize, and to evaluate effectively when you're trying to agitate, innovate, and orchestrate.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Julie. Just sort of one last point, sort of an observation that I also can make from studying cooperatives, is that sort of organizations that really aim to be idealistic and they don't want hierarchies, they want to be a completely different organization, they want to be ethical and sustainable at the core. Many of them have a problem with power, exactly as you described. It seems like some of them really don't want to be the boss, they don't want to be us, they want to share everything. And then they realize over time that that's also not possible, and sometimes it's also okay to lead or to have power over someone. Otherwise, an organization cannot really function. But the important thing is, how do you structure it? How do you involve the others? And how do you create these kind of structures that enable then sort of a legitimate use of power?
Yes, you're right, Max. And your research is tightly connected to this issue. And indeed, we have to make a distinction between hierarchical organizations and democratic organizations. So you can have an organization that really adopts democratic ways of organizing, but it doesn't mean that hierarchy is going to disappear from this organization. What it means is that employees then will have a real say and will be represented on the decision-making bodies, right? So when we're talking about democratizing companies, which you mentioned at the beginning, this movement that I contributed to co-founded and that I'm a part of, which is the Democratizing Work initiative. If you think about it, if you're democratizing an organization, what you have to care about is a situation in which you would go from workers and employees not having any say or just having a voice through surveys to employees being represented on the board of their organizations. It's, as you know too well, already the case with co-determination in Germany and in a number of European countries. And so this is something that I think we ought to consider more and to study more as well. And this is, I know exactly what you're doing, and this is happening in Europe. Interestingly, what people often do not know is that one of the very first co-determination laws was actually passed in Massachusetts at the beginning of the 20th century. It's not been used much, but it's there. That shows that even at the time, people were thinking about those issues, how to run organizations in more democratic ways. And you're right, it doesn't mean there's no hierarchy. It just means that there's thoughtfulness in terms of who decides and how we collectively make the decisions.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. So now let's turn our attention to the really great questions that have come in. So let me start by asking you, coming back to the framing you provided in the beginning, neoliberalism. The question is, should the exercise of collective individual power be sustained in a manner that remains antagonistic to the neoliberal ideology, or must it accommodate or adopt the dominant ideology to have a positive effect?
Okay, so I just wanted to look at that question so that I see where it is, but you may.
Yeah, it is the the fourth question in the Q&A.
Okay.
It's anonymous, that's why I can't tell the name.
Yeah. Should the exercise of collective individual power be sustained in a manner that remain antagonistic to the neural limits, accommodate to it? Well, that's a good question. And by the way, I also saw the question about where I would go, and there are many books we reference in the book itself. One of them is a book by Wendy Brown, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, that you may want to go and check, but there are many other references that you can find in the book across the chapters, and especially in chapter 8. Well, the question is a question really about framing and how the framing affects the way in which we behave, because indeed the risk of my research is on divergent change, breaking with the norms, and the risk, if you frame changes as being really divergent and you say you're breaking with all the norms, that people are going to reject these changes because they are too divergent, and the level of resistance will be higher. Now, the risk, though, is that if you pretend things are not divergent, at the end of the day, those resisting can actually convince you to give up on the change, right? And this is what I've seen over and over in my research on networks and change. So I think it's a fine line. We have to be very careful. We have to find the right way to engage people. And for that, we have to think about not only the narrative we use with the champions of change, those who really want to change our social and economic systems, but I think we have to think about the right way to communicate with the fence sitters, the people who don't really know, they're ambivalent, they don't really care. We need to somehow bring their attention to the issues and push them to take action and to join the movement. And I think that the crisis we're experiencing now is a huge window of opportunity for us to be able to do that. And I think that what we can also do today when it comes to diverging from the neoliberal system is turn to all of the existing innovations that have been pilot tested across the world and that have worked over the past decades. And this is where I think that we researchers can, I hope, modestly contribute. We have documented a number of these innovations. Like Max, you were talking about companies that have been doing things differently. I've studied a lot of what I call these hybrid organizations, or these social enterprises. They've been an amazing laboratory for how to do business differently. Now we can turn to them and we can try to implement what we've learned from them to other companies. Now that's going to require to also change the ecosystem, the laws and the institutions, but I think we're getting there. So you're probably right to bring our attention to how much should we really frame things as being radically different. But I would say that in the moment we are now, the Great Resignation in the United States really shows that, employees have said enough is enough. They actually want something very different from the neoliberal system, the way it's been. So as long as you meet them where they are and that you understand what's going to resonate with their needs and wants, I think it's a moment in time when we can diverge more.
So the next question I would like to bring in is from Lindsay Sang. So she asks, what is your opinion regarding how power is deployed in an organization? Traditionally, ownership defines the power, which lead to a top-down model of power deployment. But it seems your research from the French manufacturer revealed different paths with power flows in the organization.
Yes, so this is true. The research that I shared shows that the people at the top are not necessarily the most powerful ones, right? Now, that being said, I want to talk more about your question about how power is currently deployed in organizations, and I'll talk about companies. What has happened as a result of the pandemic is that we've all become much more aware of the critical importance of essential workers, right? And so that has certainly changed the narrative. The reality of the situation, though, is that even though we've been praising the work of essential workers the way we should have, we haven't really changed the working conditions, right? I mean, there are still huge salary gaps, and everyone's contribution at work is not recognized the way it should be recognized. And importantly, most of the companies still have indeed a very top-down approach to making decisions, and employees are not really consulted or don't have a formal say in any of the decisions that are made. Now, not surprisingly, that has led to extreme inequalities. Like just in the United States, the salaries of CEOs, their salary has increased by 1,300% over the past 40 years. In the meantime, the salary of workers has increased by 18%, right? So it's pretty clear that the system we've had with the top-down approach has been a system that has led to increased inequalities. And companies, organizations have been vehicles that have reinforced these inequalities at the societal level. Now, this is why I would say that's what needed now is a new model at the organizational model, and a model that I think should be characterized by two things. And we talk about that in chapter 8. And this is tightly connected to this other book we're about to publish with the Democratized Work Initiative. So what are, I think, the two changes that are needed? More power sharing, and then holding those in power accountable in different ways in organizations and in companies. So more power sharing, what do I need? I mean, more power sharing between shareholders and their representatives, top managers, and employees. We were talking about that earlier with Max. We have examples of systems of co-determination. We also have the example of workers on cooperatives. There are alternatives to the purely top-down system. There are alternatives in which workers have a say, a real say, and participate in the decisions. And so I think that it's now time for us to consider these alternatives and really involve everyone more, because this is what people actually ask for and want. In terms of power sharing, I want to be clear about the fact that what we need to do is better share power, not only between shareholders, top executives, and employees, but we also need to share power better across categories of population in an organization, right? We just went through Me Too, Black Lives Matter. There are still inequalities in organizations. Look at just salaries between men and women, racialized groups and other groups. So we have to address these issues and make organizations more inclusive. And in the book, we give the example of Helen Oshua, who was the director of the Johnson Space Center at NASA, first Latina woman to go to space in the United States. And when she became the head of the Johnson Space Center, she wanted to make it truly more inclusive, to really share power. And how did she do that? She did that the right way. She understood it was about power and power distribution. So she analyzed all of the processes and systems in the organization, formal and informal ones. She got to understand with the committee representing all the employees what was working and what was not. And then she changed the systems and processes to better allocate resources to everyone in the organization. One example of informal processes is who's going to give a tour to Michelle Obama, who's coming today to the Johnson Space Center, right? We could say Max has been doing it so well for the past 15 years. Let's go to Max. No, if you want to redistribute power, then you have to say, well, you know, Max has been doing it, but we need to let other people know they can raise their hands, that they get to meet Michelle Obama and they get to build that kind of relational power as well. And so the second dimension beyond power sharing in organizations, as I said, is holding those in power accountable, but not only for financial performance, also for the social and environmental impacts of their organizations. And this is where social enterprises can be a model for the changes to implement internally, and that's the research I've done. But beyond that, we need to change the rules of the game. And so this is a critical moment now. In Europe, a lot is happening with the new directive, as you know. It's going to, I think, become mandatory for companies soon to report on their social, environmental, and financial performance. The decision on the metrics we'll use are highly political, and I think we should all get involved and we all have a role to play. But once we have the metrics in place, governments will be able to change the laws. And you could imagine a taxation system in which, you know what, maybe you did very well financially, but you're mistreating your employees and you're polluting a lot and you're going to pay much more taxes than the organization next to you. And if we make these changes happen, then we could be in a world in which you do well, you do good, we do well. We're not yet there.
Thanks, Julie. So I want to combine two questions that go a bit in a similar direction in terms of pointing to individual agency on the one hand, where it seems like your framework is more focused on, and then the structural aspect of power imbalances and inequalities and the systemic dimension. So many would say, well, the individual agency in our systems is limited, and so a framework like this might frustrate people in saying, well, then I do this sophisticated power map, and in the end, I discover I'm just a little employee somewhere, or and I cannot really affect change because we have big systems that are not easy to change. And Josephine Matthews mentions, for example, the energy transition, going from fossil fuel-driven economy to a regenerative economy. And this transition is obviously very structural and systemic. And so how would you see that tension between individual agency on the one hand and the structural systemic dimension of power on the other hand?
Yeah, thank you for asking this question. To me, it's always it is my frustration when I can only present for 20, 25 minutes, because this is the reason why we wrote that book. And this is the reason why the book is not only made up of the first 4 chapters, but then you have the second part of the book and the 4 additional chapters. And I've really been thinking about the first 4 chapters building up to get to that second part, because this is what I personally deeply care about. So you're absolutely right. There are power hierarchies in society, structures of power that are, like accepted orders of who command more versus less power. And these structures of power empower some of us, enable us to have access to more resources, and constrain others. And they're very sticky. I say they're sticky because we know how they're created. Figures of authority use the power they have to justify some kind of ranking. Then they use stories, the legitimizing myths, to say this is how things should be. And then the psychology of those in power and the power disadvantage changes, like all of those psychologies change. And they all together reinforce the status quo. The story is the same for sexism, for racism, for like the exclusion of people depending on their sexual orientation. The mechanisms are the same. Now, the thing though is that you still need to understand the fundamentals of power to understand how these power hierarchies are built and how they're reproduced. And I think that you need to understand these mechanisms if you want to change them and fight those unjust power hierarchies and disrupt them. And the issue, though, is that you're right to point. They are deeply entrenched. And so there is not much we can do by ourselves. But this is the reason why I insisted on social movements. And we have multiple chapters dealing with those social movements. We cannot do much alone, but there's a lot we can achieve all together as part of these collective movements for change. Now, thinking about MLK, right? Talking about change is like to say, and he knew so much about the importance of the collective action we can rely on to push for changes and disrupt unjust power hierarchies. He liked to say that the challenge for change makers is to accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. And so my hope is that, again, the book will modestly contribute to equipping some of those change makers with more of the tools to understand the power dynamics, to think about how they can combine their sources of power to sustain the action that we need to change the power structures. Now, it's incredibly difficult. It is time consuming. A lot of the people involved will not get recognized, will not get awards, and yet they're doing the work that I think is the most important for all of us and to our future generations. And so that was also the idea with the book, highlighting the profiles of some of these people we don't know about, we don't talk enough about, and who do so much, and trying to, through their example, give tools to others who I hope will want to emulate them.
Yeah, thanks. Let me bring in another question regarding your distinction between sort of agitation and orchestration, and whether agitation might be more alienating to people because it maybe creates conflicts and makes them public, and whether sort of a form of activism that is more inclusive and sort of more driven by providing an inspiring and compelling vision, whether that's the better approach.
Yeah, I mean, there's the excellent research of my colleague, Vera Cordero, that we mentioned in chapter 6 of the book. She's looked at violent versus non-violent movements, and she finds that the non-violent ones, precisely because they're more inclusive, precisely because people then are more likely to show up, have overall been more effective. It doesn't mean that they are always a solution, right? Again, let's not simplify things. There are situations when you're talking about dictatorial regimes where, sadly, as we know, when people unite forces and get together, even if their approach is non-violent, violence then comes to be part of the mix. But I was immediately thinking about her excellent research and wanted to mention it. Now, the other thing I want to mention related to agitation is that be it for agitation, innovation, or orchestration, they are traps that we have to be mindful of. And I think that what you're talking about now is a critical trap facing agitators, which is if you agitate, the very effective agitators tend to define themselves in opposition to others, right, and to a system. But what is it that can happen? What can happen is that the agitation can be scattered and may not really go anywhere. And if this is problematic, or even worse, the agitation can be so extreme that it can actually undermine the role of innovators. And that's highly problematic when agitators actually highlight issues and turn to agitators who offers a solution that just undermine the work of these innovators, because then that's when we get stuck. and nothing can be done to address the problem, right? The critical thing to think about is agitating is about bringing people's attention to an issue and wanting to get them in motion so that they start joining the movement. What we do know is that emotions play a critical role in pushing people to action. We've learned that in social psychology, and we see that in all of the work in organization theory on social movements. We know that anger can lead people to action, but that it has to be combined with a sense of hope. Like when people feel the sense of anger and outrage, but then they see something else, they have a sense of hope, that's when they can go take action. When agitation actually ends up leading to people to feeling completely helpless and powerless and stuck, then that's the kind of agitation that's really not going anywhere. And that I think is problematic. And so we have to think carefully about that in the way we craft the messages, in the way we craft the narratives. The sense of hope has to be there so that people take action.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. That unfortunately already concludes our session. 1 hour really flies pretty quickly when one talks about power. So thanks a lot, Julie, for sharing your insights. It was really interesting. So I want to invite everyone who has still a few minutes of time to join us in a different Zoom meeting room. And I put the link in the chat box. So just copy it, because as you know, once I close this Zoom webinar, the link is gone. So just copy it somewhere so that you can access the other Zoom room. It will be the traditional Zoom meeting, so we will be able to see each other and interact with each other more directly. And Julie kindly agreed to be there for a few minutes with us. So I hope we see some of you there to continue the conversation. And the other thing I wanted to emphasize is that we have another really interesting speaker series event coming up in February. Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever, and Sanda Ojiambo from the UN Global Compact will join us to talk about the net zero vision, how companies can become a positive force for the climate. So that's another event coming up in February. So please, if you are interested, register. I put the link in the chat as well. So with that, I just want to thank Julie once more for joining us and sharing her insights. I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us here for this event. I want to thank the team of the Trinity Center for Social Innovation for the support. And I hope we can see you around very soon. So thank you
so much.
Thanks, Julie, and see you in a few seconds in the different room. Bye-bye.
See you shortly. Thanks again. Bye-bye.